everyone, and welcome back. In this opportunity, we will be discussing some important terms from chapter number 2, Life is Chemistry. This chapter is going to guide us through understanding these little tiny components that join up together to give me everything that I can see on planet Earth, including humans. The chapter is going to start giving us some basics about what an atom is, how atoms join together, and eventually we will talk about some larger things like molecules and the important fundamental molecules for life. So let's jump right into our chapter regarding chemistry. Okay, so what is matter? Matter is defined as anything that occupies space and have some mass. So if you think about a definition like that, everything it's pretty much made of matter. Elements and compounds are things that are very similar in the way that both of these things are made of atoms. An element, it's any kind of matter that you can have that is made of only one single thing, whereas a compound, it's made of two or more atoms. So if we think about it for a second, are we humans made of just elements or are we made of compounds? I think the answer for that is very simple. We are made of compounds. As complex as we are, we need a large combination of different things to create a human being. Right? So, kind of like a cool thing. And just a little bit of how the atom is, just to get to know this a little bit more. Remember that the atom is the smallest of the levels of organization. This is the smallest thing that I can have by natural means, because I can break the atom into smaller pieces, but that is something more relating to uh, physics or the class of chemistry per se. So the atom comes from the word indivisible, which is the Greek word that comes from atomo. Indivisible means that I cannot really break it. So what can I find inside this indivisible molecule? Atoms are made of three individual things that we call subatomic particles. There is where we can find the nucleus. That's where we can find the neutrons, the protons, and the electrons. What are these three molecules? When we want to define these three molecules, what we want to think it's about charges, positive, negative, or neutral electrical charges, because each of these individual subatomic particles would have one of these three. First off, the proton, it's the molecule that has a positive charge. So this is the particle that has a positive charge. The electron is the one that is going to have a negative charge, and you can think about electron and electricity. What happens if you touch electricity? That will be very negative for you. So that's how we're going to think about the electrons. And then finally, in the word, the name of the subatomic particle kind of like gives the answer out. It's the neutron. And the neutron, it's the particle that has no charge or has a neutral charge. Like I mentioned before, what was that nucleus thing? If we imagine an atom, we imagine an atom as something in the center, and there is other subatomic particles going around this central structure. The central structure is going to be called the nucleus of the atom, and surrounding the nucleus of the atom, we are going to have electrons. We're going to have the negative charges floating around this nucleus. So what is inside of a nucleus? Inside of the nucleus, we're going to find the protons and we're going to find the neutrons. And it is going to be these two particles, the ones that are responsible for most of the weight of the atom. So when we think about atoms, we're going to think about three things. Those three fundamental particles or subatomic particles. And in order to define them, we're going to think about their charge. That's what we want to remember about the atom. Some characteristics of the atom, just to get to know the atom a little bit better. There's a couple names here that we have to remember. Okay? We have the atomic number, we have the mass number, the atomic mass, what is an isotope, and what is a radioactive isotope. Let's define those terms really quick. The atomic number, it's defined by the number of protons, positive particles, in the nucleus of the atom. Now, if we look at a periodic table, we're going to find a couple of numbers in there. Let's take, for example, that one that we have up here, which is carbon. Carbon has a big number 6 at the top there. That number is what we call the atomic number. What is that number going to tell us? If we were able to enlarge a carbon atom and count the particles inside of that nucleus, we will find how many protons? That's correct. We're going to find 6 of those subatomic particles inside of that nucleus. Very important, because there is no other atom in the periodic table that will have 6 protons, and it's not carbon. Okay, very important. So you can think about the atomic number as the social security number of each one of those elements in the periodic table. Every different number means a different element. The mass number, it's how heavy this element is. How do I get how heavy an element is? Well, that is the sum of the atomic number, or the number of protons, and the number of neutrons in the atom. So let's say, for example, that if I have carbon, and carbon has 6 protons in the nucleus, and let's say that carbon also has 6 neutrons in the nucleus, the atomic mass would be the sum of these two things, or 6 plus 6. So the atomic mass of this individual carbon atom is going to be 12, right? Not that terrible, not that terrible. And another term that we have, which is the atomic mass, that would be the weight per se of one individual atom. Which ones are more important for us? We are going to remember the atomic number and the and the mass number, because those are the ones that are going to give us hints on things further down the road. What is an isotope? Now, the best way to explain what an isotope is, believe it or not, is to talk about ice cream. Right? We know that ice cream, you might have a favorite ice cream flavor. Let's say mine is chocolate. So I go to the store and I can find several different brands of chocolate ice cream. Now, all of them are going to be chocolate ice cream, but they might not all taste the same. So it is the exact same thing in different flavors. Thinking about isotopes, it's kind of like exactly the same thing. Isotopes are elements of the same kind, but that have different weight. So their numbers might be a little different from one another, but nonetheless, they are still going to be the same element. Let's look, for example, here we have 3 elements, or 3 individual atoms, I should say. They are the same element, they're carbon. And they are isotopes of themselves, because they, even though they have the same number of protons, being 6, they have different number of neutrons in that nucleus, which gives them different weights. Kind of like our different brands of the same chocolate ice cream. All of them 3 are what we call carbon, but they have different weights. And when we have elements that differ in weight like this, we call them isotopes. Now, then what is a radioactive isotope? Well, as it happens to be, some of these elements are unstable. They are not comfortable in the configuration that they are. And in order for them to become stable or become comfortable, they have to eliminate some of their particles. And some of the particles might be neutrons that might be expelled from the nucleus of the atom in order to become stable. Now, that precisely is what radioactivity is. It's this shedding of particles from the nucleus of the atom in order to become stable. When an atom does that, we call that atom a radioactive atom. And if we're talking about isotopes that can shed particles from their nuclei, they are radioactive isotopes. Why do we talk about radioactive isotopes? Because they have an importance in the medical field, especially in the imaging field of medicine. So now that we have some information about the atoms and we understand what they are a little bit better, remember that we are talking about things that we cannot see with the naked eye, but nonetheless they join together to form larger things, which eventually lead to being a full-blown organism. So it's very important to keep in mind the presence of these atoms. So how do they get to be large and enormous like we know that they could get, like a full-blown human being? Well, it is through the concept of chemical bonding. Now, on your readings of the book, you're going to learn about electron shells and the octet rule, which is pretty much the rules that guide how do we do chemical bonding. But on this video, we're going to focus on the types of bondings that we have and what are the products that we get from those. So, a chemical bond pretty much is the action of two atoms joining together to form a molecule. Remember that two or more atoms together is going to make me a molecule. And this can happen in different ways. We're going to focus on two of those ways in which atoms can join together. One of those is what we call ionic bonding, and the other one is called covalent bonding. And the difference between those two different types of bonding is the strength in which the atoms are going to be held together. One of them has to do with electrical charges. You know how opposites attract onto one thing. That's going to be one type of chemical bonding, and the other one involves sharing of those of electrons of subatomic particles, which creates a much stronger bond to create much stronger molecules. So that's what we're going to focus on this video. Let's start with covalent bonding. What happens with covalent bonding? The first thing that we have to keep in mind is that whenever we talk about covalent bonding, we are talking about sharing of electrons. We're not giving electrons away, we are sharing them. And by sharing electrons, we form a very, very, very strong bond. The type of bond that you can find in molecules that make sugar, that make fats, that make proteins, and even larger things like organelles of a cell or tissues and all of those important structures. This type of bonding occurs whenever there is a difference in electrons in the outer shells of the atoms, but we're going to leave that for our reading as we do not want to make this video way too long. I want to focus on you to remember that covalent bonding involves the sharing of electrons, making a very, very strong bond. Another thing that it's important to remember about this kind of bonding is that we have atoms that are considered metals, and we have atoms that are considered non-metals. In the terms of covalent bonding, this is a type of bonding that occurs between elements that are non-metals. So, very strong bond, sharing of electrons between a non-metal and another non-metal. Right? Very important type of bonding. Ionic bonding, it's a type of bonding that it's a little bit weaker than the covalent bonding, and this is the common bond that we find in compounds like salts. And they involve electrical charges, positive and negative charges, and as we know, those forces or those charges attract one with the other, which is what gives us this ionic bonding. For understanding ionic bonding, we have to know what an ion is. And an ion, it's nothing else than any atom that can carry an electrical charge. If I have an atom that can carry an electrical charge, I am going to call that an ion. So electrical charges, I can have either a positive charge or I can have a negative charge, and they both have different names. If an atom carries a positive charge, the name for this is a cation. And if it carries a negative charge, this is an anion. So whenever you have together an anion and a cation, their opposite charges are going to attract, and they're going to create a special type of chemical bonding. The type of bonding that we see in salts. Why is this so important? Why is being a weak bond so important? Later on, we're going to learn about something called electrolytes. And electrolytes come from compounds that most of the time are salts. And very important anions and cations, right? They are needed for the human body, in the human body, for different kinds of chemical reactions that eventually we will get to see. So understanding how them being weak, when they go into the human body, they are able to separate into their individual components, it's going to be key for understanding these functions. So these ionic bondings, not because they are weaker, that means that they are not as good as covalent bonding. Remember that everything serves a purpose. And the same way that covalent bonding creates those stronger molecules to make your whole structural body, I also need ionic bondings that it's easy for me to break whenever I need to use them, whenever we are talking about electrolytes. So what things to remember about ionic bonding? Weaker kind of bonding, This type of bonding, it's regular for elements that are metals and elements that are non-metals, different to covalent bonding, where both of them were non-metal. So here I have one metal and one non-metal on the other hand, and that this involves the transfer of electrons instead of the sharing of electrons. And this transfer of electrons, it's what creates that electrical charge that transforms them into ions. So by having these two different electrical charges, I am going to create a force of attraction between these two, but it's a little weaker than a covalent bonding, but nonetheless very important for living things on planet Earth. Something that we need to remember. Now, when elements rearrange one with the other, that's what we call a chemical reaction. It rearranges the elements in one molecule into a different arrangement to give me a different molecule. That is the basis of what chemistry is. Two things I want you to remember from this. What is a reactant and what is a product? So the reactants are the original elements before they go in through any sort of change. And after they do the rearrangement, after they've gone through a chemical reaction, they transform into products. And up there, we have a very important chemical reaction. It's a chemical reaction that anybody studying any sort of science has to be familiar with. This is the reaction for cellular respiration. This is, that one they have right here, it's photosynthesis. But you will see eventually later that cell respiration and photosynthesis are mirror images of one another because it's a process that it's a circle, important for life on Earth. So that one right there, photosynthesis, it's the process in which plants transform carbon dioxide and water from the soil with the energy of the sun into sugars or glucose and also oxygen that we need for breathing. So what's happening in here is that I start with carbon dioxide and I start with water and then I rearrange these molecules into sugar and into oxygen, and that's what we call a chemical reaction. All of that through covalent bonding. Kind of like very, very amazing. It is that same sugar that later on my body is going to take. And it's going to do several other chemical reactions through the process of metabolism to transform that once again into the energy needed to power up my cells. Interesting, isn't it? Absolutely. Absolutely it is. The last of the types of bonding that we will discuss in this video is hydrogen bonding. And if we are talking about the strength of the bonds, covalent bonding being the strongest type of bond, ionic bonding being the second one, then hydrogen bonding is the one that it's the weakest out of the three. And hydrogen bonding, it's pretty much an attraction that occurs between the hydrogen atom and another atom that it's hungry for electrons. So instead of thinking like ionic bonding, where we have full charges, positive or completely negative, sometimes atoms and molecules end up in a state where they are not completely positive or not completely negative. So they only have this partial charges. So the hydrogen ion in molecules, it's partially positive most of the time. So whenever he finds another element, like for example oxygen, which is most of the time partially negative, there's going to be a weak attraction between the two. And that can also bring molecules together, of course, in a much, much weaker way that when it happens in ionic bonding. Now, even weaker interactions, what are we talking about? Why do we need this? It is precisely the hydrogen bonding, the force that gives water, such an important component for our lives, that gives water the ability to do certain things. For example, cohesion, it's when water molecules can stick to one another. And cohesion gives water the ability to have surface tension, which it will be important in the process of homeostasis that we will discuss later on. That also gives water the ability of being adhesive, or the ability of water to stick onto walls of a container. How is that important? Well, it is precisely this functionality of cohesion and adhesion, the It gives water the ability to move through little tiny tubes, like the roots of a plant, or even help in the process of moving blood throughout blood vessels. All of that because of weaker interaction in hydrogen bonding. If you're interested in all of this kind of like bonding things inside of your cells where there is DNA, both strands of DNA are held together by weak forces called ionic hydrogen bonding as well. So chemistry, it's pretty much everywhere in the human body. In all of the processes of the body, there is, in one way or another, atoms moving from one side to another side, which is something to keep in mind whenever we are discussing the physiology of many things. That will be it for this video. On the next video, we will talk about some molecules, specifically 4 very important molecules that are key, that are fundamental for maintaining life of living things, especially in humans. We'll be talking about the biochemical molecules or the fundamental molecules of life. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you on the next one.